Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm your host today, Chase Jarvis, founder and CEO of creativeLIVE, lifelong artist, photographer, and your guide for the next 60 minutes where we have an amazing guest. I will introduce her in just a moment. In the meantime, wherever you're tuning in from, whether you're watching at creativelive.com/TV or Facebook, YouTube Live, any of the myriads channels that we stream to, I want you to know that I can see your comments and questions. The best experience for you is going to be at creativelive.com/TV. That's where I see questions first. I will see all of the questions, though, wherever you're watching and commenting, and I will do my best endeavor to get some of those questions and comments in front of our guest. So please let us know where you're coming in from. We want to make sure we have a global representation and let our guests know that you're here to see her from all corners of the globe. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest. Roxane Gay's writing appears in Best American Mystery Stories 2014, Best American Short Stories 2012, Best Sex Writing 2012, A Public Space, McSweeney's, Tin House, Oxford American, Oxford Short Fiction, Virginia Quarterly, and many, many others. She's a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times, the author of numerous books, Ideation, An Untamed State, the New York Times bestseller Bad Feminist, which is where I originally connected with her work, the nationally bestselling Difficult Women and Hunger, her also New York Times bestselling memoir. Not to mention, she is also the author of The World of Wakanda for Marvel Comics, which is an incredible piece of work. She's several books forthcoming and is at work on all kinds of television and film projects. Please join me in a warm CreativeLIVE welcome, clapping, tapping on your desk, shouting out on the internet in whatever way you can. Please welcome Roxane Gay.
Hello.
Hi, Roxane. That is such an impressive biography across, I don't know, all kinds of different media and outlets, and that is one of the reasons that I'm excited to have you on the show, of the many. And I just wanted to say welcome to our creative community here. Where are you coming from today?
Today I am in my house in Los Angeles, California.
Nice. Same time zone. I wasn't sure. It's a little bit later in the afternoon than we normally record, so I thought you might have be making it late in New York, but I want to get straight into our program. And as I mentioned in our little pre-show conversation, so many of the people watching today identify as either creators or entrepreneurs. And one of the things that I have learned from devouring everything I can in your work is in part your effectiveness in so many different categories of art. But I want to go back for the people who are new to your work, or I'm also curious to hear you in your own words. I haven't heard this before. A description of your very, very early career where you first, say, got your break in as a writer.
Wait, what was the question?
What was your first break? Take us back to the beginning where you sort of began identifying as a creator, and how did you turn that that passion, the desire to write, to be heard, seen, into a career? Can you talk to us about your early career?
Well, I've always taken myself seriously as a writer, even when I was ridiculously young and just, writing nonsense. And I think that because I always took myself seriously as a writer, that allowed me to persist, especially during the early years when no one was interested in publishing my work. The very first essay I ever had published was an essay in a magazine called Moxie magazine, and it's, of course, long defunct. And then I published an essay in an anthology called Does Your Mama Know, about the Black lesbian experience. And then for a few years, there was nothing more that happened. I had those two sort of brief moments of success, and then it all went away. And I write both fiction and nonfiction. And so I certainly kept submitting my work throughout my 20s, and my work kept getting rejected. So I started writing erotica because I just thought, well, if these magazines are going to keep telling me my stories have too much sex, then I will just publish them you know, in publications that are only interested in sex with maybe some narrative around it. And so I have an entire career that nobody really knows about in the erotica world. And then I started to submit those very same stories again into mainstream publications, not the stories that were published, but stories in that same genre. And finally, people were starting to pay attention. And so then I had another sort of break in 2009 or 2010. I published an essay in The Rumpus called The Careless Language of Sexual Violence. And it was written in response to an article in the New York Times about a young girl who was gang raped in Cleveland, Texas. And the New York Times reported the story with a focus on the poor town and how the town was suffering. And I just was furious because who cares? The girl was like 11 years old. Let's worry about this child. And so I wrote this essay, and then the Times actually went and re-reported the story the proper way. And I've been writing nonfiction ever since, and I've always written fiction. And it was just persistence and keep just continuing to try and put my work into the public sphere with mixed degrees of success.
What was the timeline from first publication to figuring out that it wasn't going to be sustainable, then going, I guess, not having a lot of breaks, and then coming back out in the erotica space? What was that time arc?
I would say 5 years, and then 5 years from erotica to the rumpus. So it was about 10 years altogether. And then now I've been publishing for about 20 years, 25 years maybe.
It seems like such a theme for the creators that we've had on the show. There's the 10, classic 10 years, 10-year overnight success.
Mm-hmm.
You said something that I have also heard, which I wanted to get a little bit deeper on, and that is this initial success and then nothing. Yeah. And talk to me about that. That is something that I experienced, and some of the people that I'm close to that we've had on the show, but I really haven't ever sort of excavated that. And I'm wondering, is that a thing? Is that a thing that most creators go through? And then do they get a break, and then is it because they didn't capitalize on their break? They didn't do the right thing when they got the break that they did. They didn't parlay it. Like, why the quiet after the initial sort of publishing?
I don't know. I think it depends, and I think it differs from one writer to the next. I know for me, I did not stop submitting my work. I was relentless, and I think I still am. But some writers do have that initial success, and then the next rejection makes them think, oh, I should give up. This is not the world for me. And I think that's why you see a lot of lulls after an initial success, because success feels really good, and you start to assume that you're always going to meet with success. And some people have the temerity to persevere and some don't.
And was it you also said that you were very serious. Was it that seriousness, the commitment to the craft? Was it a commitment to making a living? Were you out to prove someone wrong or yourself right? Like, where did your energy and drive come from?
The seriousness was just, I loved writing. I loved it. I never thought I would make a living as a writer because I just never thought that was a possibility, partly because I was raised by Haitian parents who believed in getting a real job as a lawyer, doctor, or engineer, the Haitian trifecta. And so I just knew that I was always going to write, but that I would also always have like a quote unquote real job. And so when I took myself seriously, it's just that I genuinely enjoy writing. I'm not a tortured writer by any stretch of the imagination. I love it. It makes me feel good. I find it relaxing. I find it challenging. I find it fun. And so I allowed myself that creative outlet. And throughout my 20s and 30s, and especially in my 30s, when I started to have more success in getting essays and short stories accepted in publications, I just wanted more of that. And I was making absolutely no money. I was not paid for probably the first 15 years of my career. And so it was just ambition that pushed me forward, and it's ambition that continues to push me forward.
And where geographically were you when you first started to break into the world? Had you moved to New York and got the apartment, the classic story, or was it something different?
I was living in Lincoln, Nebraska, where I've lived in Nebraska for most of my life. And so I was living in Lincoln, and then I was living in Michigan's Upper Peninsula for graduate school. I was getting my PhD. And then I was in rural Illinois, and then I was in rural Indiana. And it was while I was at Purdue that I started to come to Los Angeles, and then I just decided, fuck it, I'm going to live in LA, and I'm going to fly back to Indiana for work every Monday, and I sure did.
Wow. Well, I think there's so many people, and I'm seeing guests from all over the world come in. We've got South Africa, New York, LA, some fellow LA people waving, Las Vegas, Florida, London. My goodness, it's midnight, London. What are you doing? Anyway, the whole world that is tuned in right now, I think that they find something refreshing. There's some clapping about your not being based in New York, where I think a lot of the universe thinks of that being the literary capital, certainly of the U.S. Was that a challenge to write, in that time?
Not at all. There's this real misperception that you have to live in New York to be a writer, and you don't. You have to have a computer or a pencil and a piece of paper. It's just not complicated. People want to put obstacles between them and publication because people think it's hard to get published, and it's not. It's hard to get published in the Paris Review, but it's not hard to get published. And so I just knew that with a little bit of research, I was going to be able to find places to send my work. And back then, you had to put your work in an envelope and take it to the post office and mail it and wait 6 months to get a response. That was generally a rejection on a little tiny slip of paper. And you had to send them the self-addressed return envelope, or you would not hear from them. And so these young writers today, I'm just like, listen, in my day, submissions back uphill, backwards, et cetera, et cetera. And so I strongly encourage writers who do not live in New York to disabuse themselves of the fantasy that you have to live in New York. First of all, New York is expensive. And second of all, writers don't make any money. So unless you want to be miserable in New York, just enjoy where you're at. It's going to be fine.
It's quite, I guess, heartwarming and painful at the same time to know that you used to have to pay for your own rejection letters, essentially, to be sent to you, right?
You did. It's like the humiliation upon humiliation.
Yeah, it's like we'll bill you. Send us your rejection letter, and we'll bill you for it.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking. Well, thanks for taking us back to some early career. I think we've got folks from South Carolina, from India, Texas, Egypt just chimed in, wanting to know about your creative process. In particular, Daryl from Facebook wants to know about your research. Is it more conceptual in nature? Is it more of an internal journey? Maybe in order to answer Daryl's question and a handful of others, you can just walk us through what your creative process from ideation to execution.
I don't have a formal creative process, which is always upsetting for people to hear, but I just sit down and I write. And I go where the writing takes me. That said, I'm one of those writers who spends a lot of time thinking about what I want to say. So I do 90% of my composition in my head. And I just have, for whatever reason, the ability to retain what I'm thinking about and to sort of retain the drafts that I create in my head. So I will spend quite a lot of time thinking. I'd like to say that I'm a slow thinker and a fast writer. And so once I feel like I've gotten a piece to where I want in my mind, then I sit down and I write it out. And it takes only a matter of hours, and then I'm good to go. And I send it off. Um, before I send it off, I read it out loud because
Ooh.
I find that's a really great way to hear a story. Are the sentences working? Are my ideas coherent? Is it pleasant to hear in terms of just the sound of the sentences? I find that it's a really great way to find logical mistakes and structural mistakes and things that could be improved. And so I do that, and then I will make revisions based on sort of how a piece sounds, and then I do send it off to a publication and hope for the best. In terms of research, now that I have the time to write more slowly, I absolutely do research. Um, and I generally do way more research than ever makes it on the page. What the research really does is inform my thinking and inform how I present my thinking. And so I like to read quite a lot around a given subject that I'm writing about so that I can feel more authoritative, more words, so I can feel more authoritative when I'm writing. And I like to write from a place of confidence when I'm trying to tackle some of the more complicated subjects of this world. And so I do that. And these days I have a research assistant. Her name is Melissa, and she's great. She's been with me now for 5 years. And so in general, I tell her, I want to write an essay about HGTV. Could you please do a deep dive on why the channel began, why they are so focused on real estate and home acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. So I give her a series of research questions, and then she goes, and she's a PhD student in geography. And so she's very curious, and she sends me way more than I ever need. But in that, I always find something interesting that takes my piece in an unexpected way and moves it. And I love that. That's what I love about research. It's that I think I know what I want to say, and I think I know what I know. And then I do all this research and realize, no, I don't quite know everything I need to know. Um, and so it's a nice moment of humility. And then I learn something more.
But you having read a lot of your writing, you seem to weave so much of your personal experience in. And how do you mesh those things, this external research, the revelation of new ideas throughout the process, contributions from your research assistant, and yet your own fabric? How do you sew that together?
I generally work with by instinct. I think about what do I think the piece needs in terms of research and in terms of external thinking, and what does the piece need in terms of personal experience. And I try to just maintain that balance because I never want to include personal information in ways that are gratuitous. If I've included personal information, there is always a really clear reason why I've done that. People will often say to me, "Oh my gosh, you're so open, and I feel like I know you." And the reality is that you know what I have allowed you to know. And I have very firm boundaries over what I will not put into the world about my personal life. And I stick to those boundaries, especially the older I get. And that's really, really useful because so many young writers, and especially women writers, queer writers, writers of color, writers in the disability community, are expected to cannibalize themselves. And then they're expected to be experts on themselves, but nothing else. And so I try to work against that as often as I can. And fortunately, I'm at a place in my career where I can.
Was that learned through experience, or what part of you was able to identify what sounds like early on and draw those boundaries?
I think I just partly experience, but partly just instinct. And I have parents who are still alive, and so and we're close. And so I think part of it was always, let me not put anything into the world that would embarrass my parents and make them unable to go to their church. So That's a really
in
great guideline.
yeah, in Nebraska, no less.
Well, now they don't live in Nebraska anymore. They live in Florida, but still, it's a really useful metric for me because I'm Haitian and Haitian families are very close. And also, like, parents are good parents. And so I don't have any sort of deep emotional thing with them that I need to relieve myself of at the expense of our relationship. And so it really just, was early on, that was a great guideline. And now I'm 45. I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. But I have a stronger sense of judgment and a stronger sense of what a piece needs versus what might be self-indulgent.
Mm. I want to go back to your comment about your parents, because you said something else earlier, which I also believe is something that our audience would benefit from hearing about it, and that is this pressure from our parents and loved ones, whether these are our parents or career counselors or peers or grandparents or whoever it is. These are people that have a strong influence on our lives, and I think the way you said it is the Haitian trifecta. They wanted to be doctor, lawyer, or what was the third one? Engineer. And how did you clearly didn't, I mean, doctor, PhD, was that the way you checked the box?
Sure
How did you manage that?
uh, I originally, when I was in college, I majored in pre-med, and then I moved to architecture, and then I gave up the ghost and graduated as a liberal arts major. And then I got my master's degree in creative writing because I just knew that my parents had these dreams for me, but I had to live my life, and I loved writing. And even though I didn't think I was going to make a living as a writer, I certainly thought I could at least get a graduate degree. And then I got my PhD in rhetoric and technical communication. I was actually going to go work at Boeing instead of teach. And the money was very good, but at the end of the day, I just could not bring myself to work for a defense contractor. So I went into academia. And it was, my parents were happy at that point because I was happy. I was doing something creative, but I also had what they considered to be a real job. And so it was a compromise of sorts. And I never regretted going to graduate school. I think everyone, if you have the opportunity to not pay for it, should go to graduate school.
The opportunity to not pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
I was one of the people who went and paid for it, and paid dearly, because not dissimilar to you, it was a lot of social coaching, and my parents thought I ought to, and yet I think I said this a lot about myself, but gosh, I want to fit in. And it doesn't occur to me, outside of what you just shared with your parents on all the stuff that I've read, that fitting in and acceptance is not something that I've heard you talk a lot about. Specifically, I'm trying to juxtapose what you just shared with wanting to please your parents and yet knowing that you were going to be a writer. Mm-hmm. So can you help reconcile those things for us?
I certainly spent quite a lot of my life trying to conform myself to please others. And I did so to my own detriment. And I think a lot of people do, but especially a lot of Haitian daughters. And it was, I don't know how I managed to, I always tried to find a way to both appease my family and be able to live with myself. And I'm a Libra. So I just found a way to make it work. And now that I'm much older and also established, now and I'm in therapy, thank God, I just make a concerted effort to recognize that I don't have to live for my parents. I don't have to live for my friends. I don't have to live for my partner. I have to do what I want to do. And so I do.
There's a lot of folks that I come in contact with in our community for whom this is a huge hurdle. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you have advice. You talked about, pleasing others to your own detriment, and you talked about being older, wiser. Do you have any advice that you could pass along? Because I think that is a hot topic for our community.
It is. The best advice I can give is it's easier said than done, but you have to recognize as early as you can in your life that you're actually never going to make anyone happy, even if you think you are. Whatever expectations they have of you are not actually about you, they're about them. And so they have their own emotional work to do. And if you achieve some arbitrary milestone that they want you to achieve, they're going to move the goalposts. And so it's important to just do what you want for yourself. I mean, within reason. We live in a world, we live in a community. And so this idea that you can just do what you want without considering others is not what I'm saying. But I do think that you should pursue the things that make you happy and make you fulfilled. And I wish more creative people in particular would do that. We have such a damaging narrative in our culture that you can't create and succeed. And it's always people who have already created and succeeded who offer that nonsense as if they're trying to close the gate behind them. You absolutely can make a go of a creative life. You may need to have 5 jobs, but you can do it and you should do it if you want. And so I just encourage people to push forward.
Would you comment on the having an extra job? I've heard you give advice that was one of the best things for your transition. And it's also a thing that's, I think, usually swept under the carpet for most creators, especially the ones that have been so successful as you have in so many different disciplines. And yet you had a, quote, day job.
I did. Until this year, I had a day job. And having a day job allowed me to take risks. It allowed me to do what I want, how I want, because I wasn't going to have to pay my rent based on how much I got paid for writing. And so when you don't have to compromise creatively, you create better work. And a day job makes that possible. I wish more writers and creative people would just suck it up and have a goddamn day job. Like, it's easier to create when the rent is paid, at least for me. If you want to sort of live that bohemian lifestyle and suffer, that's totally fine. But I'm way too old for that. And so I am a big advocate of a day job. You have a day job until you no longer need one. And if you are lucky enough to be able to quit your day job, then by all means, quit your day job and make sure you have health insurance.
Well, there you have it for anyone we had that question, like, boom, right on. And again, more folks commending you and your work, Roxanne, from Bulgaria, Brazil, Newfoundland, Melbourne, and Wyoming. Got to throw the Wyoming in there. I would like to explore how on earth you've been so successful in so many different genre, with writing as the core, but from essays and short stories to nonfiction, novels, memoirs, comic books with Marvel, opinion columns. Where did you get the range? Was that always something you envisioned for yourself? And most folks are taught to focus, and stand out in your chosen field such that you maybe then can expand. Mm-hmm. So share what your thought process was, or your actual in the flesh process was to be good at so many different things. Is that genetic? Is it gift? Is it genius? Is it work? What's the secret? Because most people are terrified of being pigeonholed, and yet developing and committing to an area of creativity is one of the best known ways to stand out.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a little bit all of the above. It seems like I do a lot of different things, but I actually don't. I do one thing. I write. Storytelling is storytelling. I just work in a lot of different genres. And I work in a lot of different genres because very early in my writing career, in my early 20s, I submitted a story to a journal. Can't even remember the name of the journal at this point. And it was a story about a Black lesbian couple in the suburbs and their little family. And the editor wrote back and he said, this was an amazing story, but it just wasn't believable because it wasn't in the ghetto. And this was probably 20 years ago. So it wasn't like today, but also what he, it was weird that he was like the ghetto. What are you talking about? First of all, we're in Lincoln, Nebraska. Like, what are you talking about? Seriously, do you even know what you're saying? And it was so racist and so breathtaking that I just knew then and there that I was never going to let an editor pigeonhole me, even if it meant I wasn't going to get published. And so I pulled the story because he refused to publish it unless I changed the setting. And I was like, I'm from West Omaha. Like, I just don't even know what you want me to do here. And I'm from the suburbs. And he didn't believe me. And I just refused. And so I was very versatile from that moment on. And I just knew, okay, you don't want me to write this kind of story. I'm going to write every kind of story. And to this day, anytime someone gives me an opportunity in a new genre, I jump at the chance because at the foundation, it's just telling a story of some kind, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, whether it's comics or film. And I just love storytelling. I love developing characters and thinking about structure and all of the craft elements that go into telling a given story. And I also love how much it confounds people.
Well, I think it underscores this idea of mastery. And you talked about the focuses on writing, and then you can be genre agnostic. Think about even your earlier comments about erotica. Did that help you understand that you could be mobile between all these different genres? That early experience writing in something maybe where you didn't see yourself, given that you took yourself seriously as a writer, but then that was your first outlet. Did that play a role in?
Definitely. I think I discovered that I didn't have to be wedded to a specific genre. I could be flexible and it would be okay. I would get the creative satisfaction regardless. And so even though I took myself seriously and no one else was, it was fine because I still found a way to do what I wanted to do.
I heard you call the comment that editor said obviously is extremely racist.
Oh.
And we are in the middle of a pandemic, but we're also in the middle of a global crisis, a crisis of racism. And as an ally and as someone who's trying to learn from not just the murder of George Floyd, but all of the actions that are happening right now, you've been so eloquent on so many different channels, and by channels I don't mean just television channels. I mean in your podcast, and I want to get to in a second, Here to Slay. I heard you. I'd like to get your perspective on a handful of things right now because you're so eloquent. I heard you paraphrase that in talking about racism, your goal isn't to minister the racist, but that you aim to affect the apathetic and those who don't participate. And I'm wondering, was that a learned experience? And if so, why and how? And do you feel like that's been effective?
Well, I've spent most of my adult life and certainly most of my professional life living in really horrible rural places. They're not horrible because they're rural. They're horrible because they're full of racist people. And so I know that they can't be reached. Nothing is going to change their minds. And even if something will change their minds, I don't have the level of grace or patience to do it. I'm not going to go talk to racist Joe over there and try and reach him to prove that I'm fucking human. It's not going to happen. My time and my intelligence is more valuable than that. And so the people I'm trying to reach are the people who are like, I don't care about politics and I don't vote, or I'm staying home because Bernie is not